So Isabella Weber is a political economist who works on China, obviously global trade and economic history. She's an assistant professor at University of Massachusetts Amherst, and today she's going to be talking about her first book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, on the market reform debate. This book is a winner of the John Robinson Prize and has received many praise and recommendations from prominent economists and institutions. And we are all looking forward to hear more about this debate and the hypotheses. So welcome, Isabella. Thanks again for joining us today. And the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Gusta, and also thanks so much to Özgür for the invitation today. It's a great pleasure to give this talk. In fact, I've received more invitations than I could ever have imagined to receive, but I have never presented my work in Turkey before. So this is a total first, and I'm very excited to be here, at least virtually. So let me try to share my screen. Okay. As Gusta has already said, the title of my book is How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. On the surface, this is really a book about the 1980s, but I'm arguing that the 1980s are extraordinarily consequential for where we are today in the global economy. So in my reading, the 1980s is really a crossroads. It's the beginning of China's economic convergence with the West. But this economic convergence came about without a wholesale institutional assimilation with the neoliberal policy regimes. At the same time, the 1980s marks a divergence between Russia's fall and China's rise. That is, between the rise and fall of the two former giants of state socialism of the 20th century, which is linked to the difference in approach that these countries pursued in their market reforms. Now, of course, it cannot be reduced to a simple policy choice, yes or no, but what I'm arguing is that the trajectory of Russia illustrates what was at stake in the Chinese case, without saying it's a perfect counterfactual or anything like that. So if we take a simple long-run view, simply using the medicine GDP data, and we look from the early 19th to the early 21st century, we can see that the paths of the different regions in the world, when we focus on China, were very different. For China, it was really a trajectory of fall and then rise, with the 1980s as the turning point. Whereas from a Western perspective, we think of the 19th and 20th century as an era of rise, and the recent decades as an era of stagnation. So in that sense, we have very different long-run trajectories in terms of the position of these countries and regions in the world, where the 1980s is this point of bifurcation. It is very clear what Russia's economic policy choice was. It has been labeled shock therapy, and broadly speaking, was a policy package that consisted of 4 elements. That is the liberalization of oil prices combined with macroeconomic austerity, where the idea is that austerity could control the general price level. These first 2 elements, overnight or as fast as possible liberalization combined with austerity, became labeled as the Big Bang. It was meant to be the big initial bang that would create the impetus for the creation of a market economy, where a market economy is perceived as, in the first instance and most importantly, meaning to get the prices right, to have the right price signals in place. This was then meant to be complemented with trade liberalization and privatization, but even the most committed shock therapists admitted that trade liberalization and privatization were subject to complicated negotiations and institutional rearrangements that tend to take time. So the shocking element in shock therapy that can be implemented quickly in many ways is the Big Bang. This is from the perspective of feasibility, but also from the perspective of neoclassical economics, the market in many ways is really the free movement of prices. That is, without the free movement of prices, you do not have a market. Therefore, you first have to liberalize prices as the first initial step towards the creation of a market economy. Again, of course, the economic outcomes in Russia cannot be reduced to the policy of shock therapy and have also to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union and so on. Nevertheless, if we want to take a snapshot of the macroeconomic outcomes of this form of transition, we get a picture of hyperinflation, and note this is on logarithmic scale here, and basically a collapse of GDP, which looks pretty mild in this graph, just because inflation is exploding so much. In contrast, China's trajectory from a planned economy to a more market-based economy looked very different. If we look at the same kind of snapshot, that is again considering inflation and GDP, we see basically the reverse image with a short period of exception in the mid-1990s, which also happens to be the most neoliberal period in China's reform trajectory. So in China, GDP growth has almost consistently outpaced the growth in the general price level. If we look from the perspective of inequality, which is of course another important dimension, yes, inequality has risen a lot in China, and it is concerning. This is only until 2015. The more recent numbers actually, there has been a downward trend. But nevertheless, if we look in terms of what has market transition done to inequality, it's generally a trend of a rapid and very fundamental increase in inequality. Nevertheless, if we look from the perspective of the average income per adult by population quantiles from 1980 to 2015, and we compare Russia and China, we find that the famous bottom 99% in China overtook the bottom 99% in Russia around 2015. And the further down we go, if we go down to the 90%, it even already happened in 2013. So in other words, in terms of the income levels, the trajectory is such that that this gigantic so-called valley of tears in the Russian case has produced a situation where this smooth upward trajectory in China now leads to an overtaking also for the lower income groups. Okay, it is fairly well known and pretty firmly established in the literature what China's reform trajectory was. That is, we know quite a bit about what kind of economic policies China chose to implement. This has been called gradualist, experimentalist, and so on. I'm here calling it gradualist dual track reform approach, and this terminology will become clearer as I move on in the talk. The standard analysis of China's reform politics is, however, framed in terms of reformers versus conservatives, which suggests that if there should have been reform, it should have been the gradualist path. And the only opposition that was around was so-called conservatives, which in this context is really Maoist and more orthodox communists who thought that this kind of reform should not have been implemented. And I argue in the book that this framing of seeing the reform simply as being produced in the tension between reformers and conservatives overlooks a fierce debate among reform economists and reform officials over how to reform. So within the reform camp itself, there was very fundamental disagreement, and the approach that later came to be called shock therapy was very much on the table in the 1980s before it had even been implemented in Eastern Europe or Russia. So my book provides a systematic assessment of this path-breaking debate in the first decade of reform, that is the crossroads of the 1980s, where, as I argue, China's basic approach to marketization has been set, which was incredibly consequential for China's economic rise in the world economy. For this book, I have conducted intensive and extensive oral history interviews with more than 50 people in China who were crucially involved in these debates in the 1980s, and also a much smaller number of foreign advisors, including from the World Bank. I've also consulted a number of archives abroad and private collections of papers that I have gained access to in China. So this work contains new empirical findings that draw from these archival and interview sources that I have uncovered. Okay, with this big picture in mind, let's zoom into the Chinese case, and let's look at the moment in the late 1970s when China was just starting to begin to reform. So we have to understand, why was there such an urge for reform after Mao's death? Mao had died in 1976. So I think it's incredibly important to consider what the ambition of the revolution had been to understand this moment in the 1970s. So of course, the revolution was about much more than economic development. However, the ambition of the revolution always included, quote, to gradually change this backward agricultural country into a civilized and progressive industrial one. And this is from the editorial in the People's Daily, which is the most important party newspaper, on October 2nd, that is the day after the revolution in 1949. So in the late 1970s, after Mao had passed away, his designated heir, Hua Guofeng, took over. Hua Guofeng initially attempted to pursue another big push industrialization that would have been basically modeled on the Soviet type of industrialization based on one big plan. However, this time, this big push industrialization was meant to be fueled with foreign technology and financed with the export of oil. It turned out that the projected oil findings did not come forward, so that this model of importing foreign technology and capital goods and exporting oil did very quickly run into a crisis. However, what it did create was an opportunity for China's officials and intellectuals to basically tour the world and see for themselves where economic development and the political debate had arrived in the late 1970s. So here, for example, Deng Liqun, who was an important reform official, who is often considered a conservative, but I argue in the book that he was actually one of the driving forces of the early years of reform, and then towards the end of the 1980s thought that marketization was going too far. So he was one of those who had toured foreign countries, and he came back and basically reported, in talking about his visit to foreign countries, sighing with emotions, that Western countries were now prosperous, rich, civilized, and polite, and there's no sign of revolution at all. So there was a sense of an severely exacerbated backwardness in China in relation to the rest of the world, while at the same time they felt like revolutionary ambitions outside of China had basically died out. So this was part of the context within which they felt they had to find a new way towards achieving material progress. Now this is not moving for some reason. Okay. So this is then also reflected in some of the early speeches of Deng Xiaoping, for example, in December 1978, that is just at the moment when Deng Xiaoping is rising to power. He's saying China's goals are to rid our country of poverty and backwardness, to catch up with or even surpass the advanced countries. I don't know what's happening, why this is not moving properly.
Would you like to perhaps stop sharing and try sharing again? Sometimes this works.
Yes. Sorry for this. Maybe I just move like this. You can see it still, right?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. So still considering this moment in the late 70s, to consult another absolutely crucial figure, which was Chun Yun, who, again, like Deng Liqun, later on was considered a conservative, but in the early period of reform, in the early years of reform, was really an architect of economic reform and one of the driving forces behind the shift away from big push industrialization or late Maoism. So Chun Yun says in 1978 at the CCP Work Conference, again, this pivotal moment in 78, it has been almost 30 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China, but there are still beggars. How can this be the case? If this problem of having enough to eat is not solved, the peasants might rise in rebellion and be led to the cities by local party leaders demanding food. So in the interviews that I have led with a whole range of reform economists, who of course all were dedicated to reform, so in that sense it's a biased sample, but who violently disagreed on how to go about reform, they basically did agree on the notion that in the late 1970s, reform was what they called a choice without choice, where the pressures really came from very basic material considerations. In this context of a recognition that China somehow had to recreate its economic system in the name of achieving economic development, a greater role for the market was considered very early on. So already in 1979, Deng Xiaoping told a foreign journalist, saying that the market is limited to capitalism is wrong. Why can't socialism practice market economics? This was in the context of a wider ideological debate around the question of the nature of socialism and the question whether China had jumped ahead in the stages of economic development from a pretty orthodox Marxist perspective, and had thus tried to revolutionize its relations of production to an extent that was not in accordance with the forces of productions. So therefore, China would need to backstep, move back to a more primary stage of socialism, and adjust the social relations of production to its low level of economic development. So this was kind of the big ideological justification that emerged in the late 70s and that prevailed in many ways until today, for why China had to revive the market mechanism. But this still left the question open, how to introduce market mechanisms into a command economy. So even if you make this ideological move, how do you actually go about it? Which on the surface seems like a small technical question, but in reality, as the contrast with Russia, I think illustrates, turned out to be an enormously consequential question of how to reform. Deng Xiaoping famously countered the Cultural Revolution narrative of politics in command with the idea of putting economics in command. However, the problem was that the economics profession was basically shattered during the Cultural Revolution. Economists had been sent to the countryside, some had been even sent to labor camps, some had been imprisoned, and the major institutes of academic research in economics were basically shut or continuing on an extremely low level of activity. So in 1980, Deng Xiaoping describes this challenge in a speech titled "The Present Situation and the Tasks Before Us." So he's saying a good number of comrades who were shunted aside for many years and haven't been back in their original post for very long have lost touch with the situation. Even those who stayed at their posts all through are confronted with new problems they find hard to grasp immediately. So in other words, while Deng Xiaoping was trying to put economics in command, economics as an academic discipline and even as a policy advising discipline, was just in the process of reinstating itself, since in the years of late Maoism, economics was basically considered a bourgeois aberration, and the study of economic forces without the study of political forces was considered as something that would harm the revolutionary project. So in this context, we have this enormous emphasis on economic reform and economics without a functioning economic discipline in place, if you want so. So in this context, then, forces emerge that become central to the economic reform debate, to the market reform debate, that are, however, outside of the formal discipline of economics. And this very much becomes the first group within the market reform debate. So China's reforms start from the countryside. In fact, the initial spark for reform comes from the countryside, and the initial breakthrough successes that enable a sustained reform trajectory are thanks to the successes of agricultural reform in the early years. The agricultural reforms start in parts from a bottom-up initiative of communes that decide to reorganize the ways in which they are producing and then get backing from higher up officials. There are also higher up officials who think that agricultural reform is critical and support and nourish these initiatives. However, there's to some degree a disconnect between these bottom-up initiatives and these high-level policy shifts. And in this disconnect emerges a group of young reform intellectuals who had spent their youth in the countryside. They were literally sent from the cities to China's villages, and some of them spent many years in the villages, living more or less with the peasants. However, coming from intellectual backgrounds in the cities, became very invested in the question of agriculture in China. So while still in the countryside, these young intellectuals were basically gathering whatever books they could get hold of and forming reading groups and all of that, trying to understand how China's agricultural economy could be reorganized, since they were experiencing the extreme poverty that still existed in China at that time. We have to remember that in 1980, China's GDP per capita was lower than that of Haiti or Sudan. So when these people returned to the cities, they continued to be committed to the question of agricultural reform, and they basically started some sort of a movement of university students, young intellectuals who started to get minor positions within the research institutes, and started to tour the countryside, trying to understand what these experiments meant and what the potential of these experiments would be. In this, they gained critical support by older generation leaders, such as, for example, Du Rongsheng, whom you can see in this picture here, who gave them support and institutional backing, even financial resources, to professionalize and implement their survey research on these bottom-up initiatives. This then resulted in a situation where some of these young intellectuals were not even party members, but ended up consulting some of China's highest political leaders. Their background was very much self-trained in Marxist classics and Maoist readings during the Cultural Revolution, but then in the late 1970s and early 80s, they started to very quickly basically try to read up on a very wide array of Western social sciences, Western social theory, social science methods, and so on. Their approach was pretty much coming from big theoretical considerations, but were working in a more or less inductive fashion, conducting empirical studies initially mainly in Hungary, in China, but later on also in Hungary and Yugoslavia. They toured some Latin American countries and also started to study the West German post-war transition, which is something that I can comment on. Okay, so this was an important group that emerged at this critical juncture and that became an important force of reform in the 1980s. But in this void of economics being meant to be in command but not really being existent, there also resurfaced a traditional way of statecraft thinking about the relationship between markets and states. This was not necessarily in the form of referencing ancient texts or referencing classics, but it was in the form of going back to certain institutional modes of operation that had existed in China literally over millennia and that were absolutely crucial to the organization of the agricultural economy. In particular, the ever-normal granaries were one of the central institutions of agricultural political economy in pre-revolution China, that is pre-first revolution China, where the state basically was running public granaries, buying grain whenever the price was low after harvest and selling grain whenever it started to become high just before harvest, or also redistributing grains between regions that had experienced a bumper harvest and regions that had a failed harvest. So this was a logic, as I'm arguing in the book, of economic and social stabilization through market creation and participation by the state. So there's no clear boundary between what is the state and what is the market. Instead, the market is in many ways created by the state. The state is organizing state commercial agencies that literally integrate the market, but the market is also stabilized by the participation of these public buffer stocks in the local and cross-regional markets. This was not only an operation for grain, but also for other important essential goods. So the logic of this kind of thinking about economic governance was to use what is heavy to shoot at what is light. That is to say, to focus on the essential parts of the system, and by governing the essential, by more or less implication, also govern the less essential parts of the system. Already under the statecraft tradition, there was an emphasis that this way of economic governance would require constant empirical assessment of the concrete prevailing dynamics, since the idea was to use the dynamics that were emerging in the economy for the purposes of the state, which required a constant monitoring of changes in the economy. Now, it's not like there's a straight line from the traditional statecraft thinking and practices to the 1980s. There's a very important intermediate point that in many ways presents a link between this more traditional statecraft mode of economic governance and what is then happening in the 1980s. And this link consists in the experience during the Chinese Civil War. So during the Chinese Civil War, when the Chinese communists were fighting the nationalists, there was an enormous problem with inflation. In fact, during the Second World War, China was one of, if not the only major belligerent power that had not implemented universal price controls. And it turned out that by the time that China tried to implement price controls, the economy was disintegrated to a point that several attempts by the nationalists involving American advisors that had very successfully implemented price controls in the United States were all a straight out failure. So that the nationalists, to some extent, lost the civil war because they did not manage to get prices under control, which eventually deprived them of the material foundations for the war effort. Now, what the communists did, in contrast, was instead of trying to control prices by dictating them through some sort of a price order, they created commercial agencies that would ensure the availability of key essential commodities that could be exchanged against the currencies that they were issuing, so that their currencies gained a real value, if you want so, because people could buy the stuff, the basic important stuff they needed with that money. And this strategy came to be called economic warfare, where very much the communists were using the market to stabilize their currency, which was critical in enabling their revolutionary war effort. After the revolution, they continued with logic. In fact, they did what later came to be called out-speculating the speculators by intervening into speculative hikes on specific commodities, by basically drawing together resources through state commercial agencies from across the countries into places where enormous speculative hikes were happening. So, for example, when there was a speculative hike on cotton in Shanghai, they started to flood the market with cotton in a very targeted fashion, which created a turnaround in the price, which then created panic on the part of private speculators who tried to pull out of this market as quickly as possible, which then created a wave of bankruptcies on the part of the private speculators, which led for the price of cotton to crash. And once it went down, they started controlling it, and they basically took over the private speculators that had gone bust. So in that sense, they used the market dynamic as a weapon in the economic warfare, but also in the attempt of reintegrating the national economy after the war and after the revolution. So the leaders that were in power in the 1980s in China were from that first generation of revolutionary leaders. Some of the key figures, in fact, had like Chun Yun, had very direct experience with this way of using the market as a tool in pursuit of political goals. So when they then tried to revive markets, they in many ways went back to this same kind of logic. In fact, in the documents of World Bank meetings that I've been going through, there are these points where, for example, after a 2-day meeting between World Bank officials and very senior Chinese economic and political officials, the World Bank official scribbles in his notebook saying, why do the Chinese answer to every question about market reform that they have to go back to the liberation period policies? So this is something that is very explicitly on the mind of these senior leaders. Okay, with this broad tapestry of sources of inspiration for how to think about the recreation of markets in the absence of formal economics in mind, let us take a quick look at how agricultural reforms came about, since the method of reform in the agricultural sector then was in many ways transferred into the urban industrial sector. So if, as a matter of a heuristic, we summarize the agricultural economy as I'm trying to do here, we can think of it as a system where each people's commune, which is here depicted as a triangle, is meant to deliver a grain quota at a state set price to the national grain system. So basically, it's a form of delivery of a quota at a set price. In return for the delivery of the quota, the commune gets the price. But these prices were set in a way that reflected the so-called price scissors, so that they were systematically to the disadvantage of the agricultural economy, such as to extract resources for industrialization from the countryside. Now, in this picture, it looks as if every commune, sorry, there's one arrow missing here. Anyways, it looks as if every commune was delivering a similar kind of grain quota, which in reality was, of course, not the case, but there were regions that were the grain chambers of the country, and there were other regions that were so poor and where grain production was so small that they could hardly feed themselves, so that the delivery of the quota was really extremely small, or in some cases even a net transfer to the communes. So when reform started, it was in many ways initially a letting go of the control over the communes that had, before reform, not contributed much to the national grain system. So in that sense, it was letting go of control over parts of the system that were not essential to the operation of the system as a whole. These poor communities then started to experiment with the so-called household responsibility system, where the grain production was now split up into responsibilities of each household, where if the households managed to produce more than the collective goal of grain production, they could be producing for their own accounts, which very quickly resulted in a pretty unexpected rapid increase in grain production, to an extent that some of these very poor regions started to become more considerable grain producers. This system was then transferred across the country, where for the major grain producers, the grain quota was maintained in the first instance. So households had to produce their share in the grain quota. But once the commune, broken down into households, delivered that grain quota, they could produce for the market at market prices. So that you got a dual track price system of market prices and plant prices, and market production and plant production existing at the same time. The system in the urban industrial economy was quite different from the agricultural economy. It was modeled based on the idea of one big national workshop, which meant that unlike the communes, where each of the communes used to be more or less a closed, not exactly closed, but more or less self-sufficient unit by its own, you here had production units that were producing inputs for other production units, and that were receiving inputs from other production units. So in this context, then, each production unit would have to deliver their commanded part of the plan and would get a price in return, where this price would be set by the central command authorities, and as such would be more of an accounting operation, at least on the surface, rather than a price signal of the kind that we think of in the context of market economies. However, these prices were not meaningless. Instead, they did in fact perform an important function, since they were basically a redistributive mechanism, not only between the industrial and the agricultural economy, as I've already hinted at, but also between different sectors of the industrial economy. So so-called luxury goods, think of radios, wristwatches, bicycles, and that kind of thing, had prices that were set relatively high to basically extract liquidity from the households, whereas the prices of the most upstream, most essential industrial inputs were set relatively low, which was meant to encourage the building up of more downstream industries, so that you in effect had a redistribution between the sectors via these prices that were set relatively high in relation to some sort of notion of cost, or relatively low in relation to some sort of cost. With these low prices in the upstream sector, you had some mines and steel mills and so on that were operating quite consciously at a loss. But the idea was that what they were producing was so important for the system as a whole that it didn't matter that these units taken individually would be operating at a loss. Okay, so now as the agricultural reforms were starting to be in full swing and people in the countryside started to produce not only for the plant but also for the market, they generated a small but still in total significant cash income, which created a new kind of demand for downstream consumer goods in the urban industrial sector. It also created an environment in which people in the countryside started to move from agricultural sideline production to producing small light industry, small scale industrial goods in the so-called township and village enterprises. Now, pretty much for any kind of township and village enterprise, you would need some amount of raw materials that would be coming from the urban industrial system, so that you also had a new kind of demand for upstream goods coming both from the increased demand for downstream goods as well as the popping up of small industrial enterprises in the countryside. So that more or less endogenously, there was the emergence of a gray area that was catering to the market in the command economy of the urban industrial part of the country. So the big question then was, is this emergence of markets in the periphery of the urban industrial economy something that is bad, that is an aberration that needs to be suppressed? Or is this something that could be used as a dynamic of market creation in the name of fostering growth and development? And this question, what to do with the urban industrial sector, whether or not to encourage this more or less spontaneous growth of markets, became subject of a pretty much countrywide debate in which a youth conference that was held in 1984, the so-called Morgenstern Youth Conference, came to play an important role, where basically certain leading young intellectuals in Beijing had summoned young reform thinkers from across the country to convene and discuss the big questions of reform, where this question of price reform became the central one, and they eventually settled on a proposal for a dual-track system. This proposal then gained the approval of the national leadership and eventually actually became national policy in 1984. Zhao Ziyang, who was the prime minister in the 1980s and who was absolutely critical in this whole process, also in bringing up these young reform intellectuals, then after this political decision for the dual track price system in the urban industrial sector, explained to local cadres what this new system would mean. And he said that it would mean three things. First of all, it would mean letting go, which would only apply to small or inessential commodities and some new products and services. The state should not overstretch its control. It should focus its control on the essential parts of the system and let go of the small parts, liberalize the small inessential parts of the system. However, what was small or big is not at all straightforward. So, for example, there was a huge debate around the question of the price of matches, which on the surface seems like a small, not so important commodity. However, in the context of 1980s China, when pretty much everyone was cooking and heating with fire, the price of matches was extremely important, and matches were an absolutely essential commodity. So as a result of this thinking, there were endless discussions around the questions of specific commodities and what their position within the system as a whole would be. Second, there should be a reform of the price management system, mainly in the form of decentralization. And third, there should be an adjustment of prices in the most upstream sectors, where these prices should be increased in small steps to bring them closer to any notion of cost, but it should be done very carefully and in small steps to avoid chain reactions. And then fourthly, there should be a policy of participation, which is what I would like to stress here, which goes back to this whole story that I've told you about the granaries and economic warfare and all of that, where Zhao Ziyang, the prime minister, is saying, after having enlivened prices by letting them go, the state had to participate in the market to regulate the prices. This is the strategy that proved successful in the first years after liberation. And the prices of the most important production materials, such as coal, oil, steel, and chemicals, should continue to be regulated. However, they should be regulated in two ways. The share under the state plan should continue to have prices set by the state. But the market plan, where prices were allowed to fluctuate on the market, should be regulated by limiting the range of fluctuations through state market participation and state buffer stocks. And in fact, this is a logic that in many ways still prevails in China in earlier in 2021. China, for example, released parts of its state reserves for certain metals where the prices were increasing rapidly and creating the danger of cost push inflation. Okay, this now brings me to the second group in the market reform debate. And I've spent much more time on the first group because I think the second one should come pretty intuitively to anyone who is trained in economics. So basically, this group came to be called the Package Price Reform Group. It was composed of middle-aged established intellectuals and young academics, often engineers and scientists. These middle-aged established intellectuals had a background in orthodox socialist economics, often of a Soviet type, and then in the 80s were also the first to study modern economics in the United States and England. Here, for example, Wu Jingyan, one of the figureheads of this group, who was the first to study in Yale comparative economic systems and undergraduate micro and macroeconomics in 1983. They drew their inspiration from the socialist calculation debate, but also from Eastern European emigre economists like Bruce, Ottachik, and Kornai, as well as monetarists like Milton Friedman and Gregory Chow. In fact, all of these people visited China in the early 80s and Kornai in the mid 80s, but the other two Eastern Europeans in the early 80s. And in fact, the World Bank very much fostered the exchange between Eastern European emigre economists, who were very good neoclassical economists, but who also were fluent in the language of socialism and were intimately familiar with the challenges of socialist reform. And basically, as one of the World Bank people was saying, these emigre economists were the perfect ambassadors of what they are calling modern economics, because they understood the language that the Chinese were speaking, but they also understood the language of the kind of mainstream economics that was emerging at the time. This is here an image of the 1982 World Bank World Bank conference organized in collaboration with the Chinese Price Research Center, interestingly held in the same place as the conference that I've mentioned before, where you see a number of these Eastern European visitors here in the middle. This is Bruce. This is Strominski, who was the former director of the price center in Poland. And this here is Peter Kende, a Hungarian, who was the only one of the Eastern European participants whom I still got to interview. When I met him in Paris in 2017, that is many years after, the gentleman was wearing the exact same outfit that he's wearing in this picture, explaining to me that he had preserved this outfit since for him it was such a bold thing to go to China and engage in a discourse with some very high-ranking officials, such as here Xu Mutiao, who's one of China's leading economic thinkers and economic officials of the 20th century, since had he returned to his native Hungary, he would have been pretty much arrested at the border based on his own assessment. So it was an extremely daring thing to do, to go to China, since this was basically entering the socialist bloc, right? However, this also shows us how daring the Chinese were, that they were willing to discuss the most sensitive question of economic system reform, that is the price question, with people who were basically considered dissidents in their home countries. Okay, from these exchanges then emerged a critique of the dual track system, where the argument was that the dual track system would create friction and contradiction, and in fact was in some sense a more irrational system than a planned economy. Yes, maybe it should be tolerated for the transition, but it should be overcome as quickly as possible, since it also created inherent rent-seeking opportunities and opportunities for corruption on the part of officials that were facing two different prices and that had access to the cheap prices under the plan and could sell them at a high price on the market. This critique, of course, was warranted, since there was an emergence of corruption, which gave this side of the debate a certain credibility. So they suggested to impose tight fiscal and monetary control, and then to implement a wage and tax reform, letting go of prices as quickly as possible, and in particular, letting go of the core of the industrial system. The main question was not whether or not to liberalize small or inessential parts, but the main question was whether or not to liberalize the prices of the industrial backbone of the system. So those who had argued for a dual track system then hold against this proposal that a big bang would cause cost push inflation without, however, adjusting relative prices. Since, as after all, Kornai had argued, these production units were socialist enterprises that face a soft budget constraint. And I apologize, something went wrong in the formatting here after I opened the slides. But in any case, the idea was that since the prices of upstream industrial inputs were, quote unquote, artificially low before reform, which was the whole point why one wanted to liberalize these prices in order to adjust them, because they were so far away from any kind of notion of equilibrium prices. But this meant that these prices, once liberalized, would shoot up, which would mean that these price increases would be handed down to the next unit. And since all of these production units did not face any strict budget constraints, they would simply pay the higher prices, so that eventually these price increases would be handed down to the retail sector and would create pressure on wages. And since workers were still part of socialist production units, they had a lot of leeway to ask for wage increases. So this would then generate a wage price spiral that in their reading could not be contained by macroeconomic austerity and would also not correct the relative prices. So all that it would do would be to create chaos and monetary instability, and in fact deprive China of the very stability it needed in order to successfully implement market reforms. So the core of the debate then was really not whether or not to let go of the prices of inessential goods. For the inessential part of the system, the controversy was around whether the state should participate in markets to steer and guide them or not. But the most consequential, most heated debate was really whether or not the state should control of the industrial core of the economy. In 1986, China came very close to implementing the package reform, which would have been the first step towards a Big Bang, towards the logic of shock therapy. However, in 1986, this plan was stopped before it even became a national policy initiative. In 1988, Deng Xiaoping himself took initiative towards a radical reform, since the dual-track system had created so much tensions and challenges that the idea of having one clear-cut reform seemed like a promising way out. However, only the announcement of a comprehensive price reform unleashed such widespread panic that people started to hoard whatever kind of durable commodities they could get hold of, and that people reacted with local unrest in response to the announcement of these reforms, which then nevertheless created a loss of confidence in the value of money and a certain spiking of prices for the first time to an extent that created fear of an ungrounded inflation, which then led to a reversal of this proposal and ultimately a putting on hold of reforms, which taken together, this inflationary spurred local unrests combined with this reversal of reforms basically provided the breeding ground for what then ultimately happened in 1989. Being mindful of time, I'll jump to the conclusion, and I just want to conclude the two competing logics that were at stake in the market reform debate, and I'm happy to say more about 86 and 88 and 89 and all of that if you're interested in this more historical account. So in conclusion, there were really two different logics of reform that competed, and that in many ways competed way beyond the 1980s, in some sense competed until very recently. The logic of the Big Bang is grounded in comparative statics, an idealized model of the old system, and a theoretically derived target model where reforms were meant to create a shock that would enable and transition from the old to the new model. The target was complete markets with free prices, where these complete markets were meant to be achieved by destroying the plan. So the idea is to destroy the planned economy to make space for the market to emerge spontaneously. And in order to make that space, the most important thing is to make space in the most important part of the economy. That is why you want to shock the core of the system. The logic of the dual-track system, in contrast, is to start from an analysis of the prevailing economic forces and institutions and to identify ways to create reform dynamics from these prevailing dynamics and to create these dynamics at the margins of the system in order to create a form of re-industrialization that would eventually transform the core of the system, however, without undermining the basic stability. Market forces here are then a means in a larger transformation process guided by the state rather than the goal of reform itself. Thank you very much.
Great, Isabella, many thanks. So we already have a question from Ezgi. Ezgi, please go ahead.
Okay, hello. Hi, Isabella, first of all, welcome.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. So I was lucky to work with Isabella very briefly at Goldsmiths. Yeah, so good to see you here. First of all, I want to congratulate because I loved your book. The moment it came out, I ordered it and put it in the syllabus recommended to all students.
Oh.
It's very well written. And it's also, I really loved the way you carry out the price regulation debate. I mean, because you go so deep into the mechanisms. I mean, how these, price regulation mechanisms are put into action. So you raise some deeper issues about the way we approach prices. I know you wrote on that issue in your articles and in the book, but you didn't go very deep in that. Obviously, I mean, there's time constraints, but I want to, I want to just ask if you want to just, I mean, the prices, the way the market prices and planned prices work, and usually how in contemporary economics, the way we approach them is just the planned prices are wrong signals and then the market prices are right signals. But in fact, there is a difference in the way these two different economies approach prices themselves, right? I mean, there are different price theories at work. And the thing is, it's not some signals are wrong, some signals are right, but some theories do not approach prices as mere signals. And of course, I mean, this debate have been carried out by many people. I mean, for example, in the context of former Soviet Union economies, but because China is the only country where these two different systems simultaneously are at work, I think maybe it's the only case where you can just carry out this debate in a deep sense empirically, right? I think your book does that. And that's why I just liked it very much. But yeah, I just wanted to ask if you want to reflect a little bit more on that. Yeah, thank you.
Isabella, would you like to respond to Ezgi first, or would you prefer to collect the questions as they come?
Are there more questions?
Yeah, so now the floor is open for questions. So if you have, you can either unmute yourselves or you can raise your hand so that we can unmute you.
So maybe I just start answering and then we can see if more questions come up. Okay, thank you, Ezgi. I'm very flattered to hear that you both read the book and assigned it on your syllabus. Yes, this is a great and very difficult question. So yes, I mean, on one level, the book is really about, so the book has so many layers that when I give these talks, I kind of have to take decisions what to emphasize, right? And I feel like I need to kind of bring across the basic concept of what was happening in China to understand how I even get into this whole topic. But yes, there is a alternative theory of thinking of prices not simply as signals, but thinking of prices pretty much as redistributive mechanisms that can work within a plan in a very different way, but where these prices are also not set based on some sort of ideal cost plus formulas or anything like that. So it's not an optimal planning type of logic, but instead it's a very empirical logic. In fact, in China, the relative prices during the Mao period were never set from scratch. So it was always like a feeling forward, how much can we push this price up or down, with an eye to the question of what this would be doing to redistribution, right? So in that sense, price policy here in many ways is a form of income policy, but it always has to at the same time not be completely unbalanced from the signaling dynamic that prices have, right? So it then becomes this kind of balancing act that is much more feeling your way forward than the way in which we like to model and theorize prices in economics, where we think of optimal price vectors and closed systems and all of that. So yes, I think that there is a lot of challenge there for basic theorizing of prices. I would also like to emphasize that I think that the logic of stabilizing prices, not through monetary policy or through direct intervention into the prices of specific goods, but through stabilizing the specific relationship between supply and demand in certain key sectors, is actually one that renders quite contemporary if we look at the whole debate around the question of buffer stocks for energy, for gas, for oil, and so on, and the enormous instabilities that the world economy is facing right now in relation to these instabilities in specific very important prices. And this is basically a global version of the same problem that the Chinese were grappling with, because they were going through very rapid structural change, which involved severe bottlenecks and which involved temporary, pretty severe disproportionalities between certain sectors, so that having these kind of buffer stocks basically was a way to smoothen these kind of transitionary processes, which I think is extremely relevant for the ways in which we think about a green transition, where a lot of the proposals, in fact, as I've been arguing together with Daniela Gabor, have very much resonated with the logic of shock therapy, where there's some sort of an idea that you can just adjust some key prices to adjust the carbon price and then just let the market do its thing. And then somehow this would create this wonderful functioning green market economy, which is kind of the same magic thinking that we have observed in the shock therapy debate. This argument can also be elaborated in a more technical form, where this focus on upstream energy prices is actually also in parallel with the debates around shock therapy, and the whole debate around greenflation, in fact, very much resonates with the debates that emerged in the context of shock therapy and the shooting up of upstream prices in that context. Of course, drastically different political circumstances, drastically different institutional setups, nevertheless, certain parallels that cannot lead to straightforward lessons, but that can provide food for thought to develop alternative perspectives on these challenges. Okay, I know this is an inconclusive answer to a very big and important question, but thank you.
Thanks a lot.
So I think Hassan is next.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation, dear Isabella. I also enjoyed the book a lot. I have a question, which an issue that you also touch in the book, but maybe it's only tangent to the current presentation. Some of the inflationary pressures is, according to in the book, is due to actually the investment demand. There is a lot of investment demand, actually much more than planned. And what I know from my other readings is there is the performance of the local administrators in China depends on their creating of GDP growth, at least in the more recent decades. So was this the case in 80s partly, which was driving the investment, especially like infrastructure kind of? That was my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean, the general inflationary pressure, not even only in the reform era, but even before the reform era, basically comes from a situation where you want to industrialize very fast, right? So you need to bring forward a lot of investments, and you need to somehow finance these investments, right? Which during the Mao era was tried to be done by extracting surplus from the agricultural economy, but which ended up being so much to the detriment of the agricultural economy that kind of the well that was meant to feed the industrialization wasn't strong enough to actually sustain it, right? So then in the reform era, you still face this challenge, and you somehow have to reduce consumption at the end of the day in some way to sustain that level of investment, right? And if you look at the shares of investment in China, they are extraordinarily high, and they continue to be extraordinarily high, which I think is possible without very high inflation, both due to basically a form of what we might want to call forced saving, where households are saving a lot to buy apartments and all of that. I mean, we have extremely high savings rates, right? At least, I mean, it eventually changes, but in at least until the mid 2000s or so. And at the same time, you have this stabilization of specific prices that are important for actual investments, right? So that the cost of investment, in some sense, is pushed down by pushing down the cost of some of the most important ingredients of investment. So there has been so much reporting about China dumping the world market, for example, with steel, right? But having a low steel price, if you're in the middle of these like gigantic infrastructure investments that are going on, is of course also a way to lower the price of these extremely large investments. So in that sense, I think it's a combination of very conscious steering of specific prices, not by decree or command, but by ensuring the availability, ensuring high supply of these key ingredients, and a form of forced saving that has to do with the high inequalities. It has to do with the rising housing prices and all of that. I don't know if this answers your question. If you want to follow up. Okay. Maybe I could also add that, I mean, in terms of the external sector, there is this idea that China's trajectory was basically export-led growth, right? I think this is only very partially true, because even in the late 80s, when they were starting to open up more systematically, moving beyond just having special economic zones towards like developing a broader export industry, there was a very clear and explicit awareness that given China's size, China could not be like Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, or even Japan, because the demand that China needed to achieve sustained growth in the long run, and we are here talking about people who are thinking in time spans of 50 years or so, right, could not simply come from the external sector, because if China was meant to be successful in its catching up exercise, then this would mean that eventually China would be a very large part of the world economy, right? So they could not simply rely on the external sector in the ways in which smaller countries might have done. Now, the key for exports, at least in the early phases of reform, was really that building up export sectors in the light industry downstream parts would be a way to bring in foreign finance that could then be reinvested in more upstream industries that could be used for technological upgrading without endangering foreign indebtedness. So being able to export very large amounts initially was thought of as a strategy to generate foreign revenues for the project of reindustrialization. Of course, this then takes on a life of its own, and all of that. I mean, we know what happens after 2001 when China becomes a member of the World Trade Organization and all of this. But I think it's important to see that that there is a constant awareness that yes, export has an important role to play. It can also in the transition be an important fuel to China's internal growth. However, what we are seeing now with the so-called dual circulation strategy, the so-called reorientation of the Chinese economy and so on, looking from the perspective of the late 1980s, it's not at all surprising. In fact, even the terminology of dual circulation was already present in the late 80s. So in that sense, then this is like part of a very long run development strategy rather than a sudden shift from export-led to domestic demand-driven growth.
So there's a question from the chat screen. I will read it out loud from Ulvi Sarkarlı. When the former Soviet countries and Warsaw Pact countries gained independence, some of them approved the Big Bang and others followed the dual-track liberalization path, at least for the limited period. Are there any comparisons of China, not just with the 1980s USSR, but with the first half 1990s former USSR and Warsaw Pact experiences? Thank you in advance.
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, to be quite frank, my book is not a comparative history of Russia and China. I'm bringing in Russia to illustrate what was at stake, not to say that the exact same thing would have happened in China or anything like that, but just to illustrate how dramatically different things played out in the Russian case, and to show that this debate over the question of Big Bang could have been quite consequential. Whether it actually would have been or not, God knows, right? But it gives us a sense of the magnitude of what is at stake. The comparison with other cases is definitely interesting. I've actually started working with Cornel Bahn, who has done a lot of work on the Romanian case, which is, of course, on the surface very different, but then still to some degree similar in terms of its position in relation to the other socialist countries and all of that. And what it turns out that at least in the Romanian case, there were some very similar proposals on the table that, however, could ultimately not be implemented, basically due to the pressure of the IMF, which created a political deadlock that undermined the possibility of pursuing these proposals. This being said, at least from the perspective of what I have studied on the early 80s, and I know this is not your question, but still, the ways in which the Eastern European visitors have thought about gradualism was very different from what the Chinese were referring to when they were talking about gradualism. So I think when we talk about gradualism, we kind of have to be very careful if we are actually referring to the same thing, since there was a kind of gradualism that was basically having a planned transition from an initial model to a target model, and then breaking this up in not one shock, but 2, 3, 4, 5 steps towards that target model, but basically still following the same basic kind of logic of transition. Whereas what we see in China, I think, is contingent on a very specific kind of state-market relationship, on the ability of state agencies to act as market participants and market creators, which I don't know if it would have been possible in the Eastern European context. It might well have been possible. For the Chinese case, I think it's quite important to see that many of the people who were in charge in the 80s, as I've tried to emphasize, still had these first-hand experiences with creating, playing, using markets. So they were not naive about markets in the ways in which some people, even within China, who were of that younger generation, who had been born into Maoist China, who were brought up on Soviet economics, and who basically didn't have any quote unquote real experiences with how markets work, and had very idealized type of visions, which I could see might have been more prevalent in the context of countries where the revolutions were further back, and where the generation that was in charge was basically a form of nomenclature that had been brought up within the socialist bureaucracies, rather than from this agricultural guerrilla fight. I mean, very, very long guerrilla fight in the Chinese case.
There's a question from the chat screen from Ercan Eren. Let me first read that. Is the market in China a market similar to that of the Lenin era, the new economic policy, political capitalism, or similar to Japan or South Korea? Has the market been internalized?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, there are certainly important similarities with the new economic policy. In fact, in the 70s, there was a whole revival of reading Bukharin, reading Lenin, reading the classical interpretations of the Soviet industrialization debate and the question of new economic policy. So there certainly is a certain similarity. We can also think of the tax in kind as being analytically, to some degree, similar to the dual track price system and the household responsibility system in the Chinese context. So in that sense, yes, there is a parallel and there is a similarity. I mean, interestingly, even in Taiwan, Jian Jingguo, the president who later on is quite important for the reforms, actually also spent some time in Russia during the new economic policy. So there are all these like interesting and quite unlikely connections. That being said, I think that today, 40 years, more than 40 years into market creation and experimentation in China, it is hard to understand China by simply saying, oh, it's like the new economic policy, or oh, it's like Korea, or oh, it's like Japan, because we are dealing with a system that has undergone more than 40 years of systematic experimentation and institutional calibration that has followed its own very specific dynamic, and that I think is more and more being recognized as a new kind of economic system that has borrowed from all sorts of experiences, but it has borrowed instead of copied. And I think this is something that is really important in trying to understand how China has evolved. They have not gone around and tried to copy what country A or B did, but they have gone to other countries, studied their experiences, tried to understand where things went right and where things went wrong, and what the initial conditions were under which certain policies were implemented, and then ask themselves, how does this compare to our situation? What can we learn from this? How can we adapt this to our local context, often involving local experiments before it even becomes province level policy, let alone national policy. So by the time it becomes a Chinese system-wide policy, it has gone through so many steps of calibration and adjustment and local adaptation that, yes, we can trace a source of inspiration, but it's not simply an importation of a foreign mechanism.
Özgür Hocam. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, one last sentence, if I may. Sorry. So there's actually also some interesting research that came out from Eric Helleiner recently in New Political Economy, where he's arguing that the South Korean and Japanese so-called developmental states actually also drew inspiration from the Chinese statecraft tradition and the Chinese reform movements of the 19th century, so that it's not so clear that there's like an importation from Japan or Korea into China, but that there's this whole, I mean, East Asian long-standing exchanges on very foundational questions of how states and markets work and how they can govern markets and how they can govern the economy and what they can do for development and so on, that I think has to be seen more as an ecosystem that we have to study, rather than like some sort of links of influence where then often the story goes like list from Germany inspired Japan and Korea, and then Japan and Korea inspired China or something like that. I think we have to study this more as an ecosystem of economic thinking and policy making that needs to be seen in the context of this relational, long-standing histories.
Okay, I can talk now, right? Sorry for the previous interruption. Özgür Hocam, please go ahead.
Thanks. Well, Isabella, unlike Hasan and Ezgi, I haven't quite finished reading your work yet, but your presentation has triggered a number of questions. that I want to just throw at you and to see your reaction if you want to like pick any one of them. I mean, to me, one could argue that the whole sort of like starting from the classical political economy, the essence of economics has been about like price theory, right? So the whole growth and distribution debates and the whole like the determination of prices, all of them kind of like following up from, in a way, from Ezgi's question as well. And I was just curious if in your studies you come across to any debates among the Chinese or like with the invited experts and so on in terms of like the price theory, right? In the social calculation debates, there's a lot of discussions about like how prices are determined, what determines the prices. At the beginning of like early USSR, there's this discussion about like the labor theory of value and how it's going to actually evolve under socialism and so on and so forth. So does this make an appearance in these debates at all? That's the first question that sort of comes to my mind. The second one, of course, again, sort of like following from the same thing, you mentioned how the prices were used or could be used in this dual price system as a way to trigger certain sort of like sectors or industries and whatever. But in the classical development theories as well, right? There is the idea of unbalanced growth and creating bottlenecks to spur, growth and innovation. Those kind of things. So, do you, from studying all these debates and experiences, do you actually derive any lessons or conclusions that that can be used? Maybe you mentioned maybe like in terms of green transition, this could be, or are the Chinese sort of like trying to use these kind of like mechanisms for the technological catch up as well and stuff like that? So that's kind of like the second question. Let me just throw in the third one as well. I found your quote, to use what is heavy to shoot, what is light, kind of interesting, because in all the conversations I had with the Chinese colleagues about the nature of the Chinese economic system, they would argue that the Chinese economy should still be considered socialist because the state essentially controls the heavy parts or the significant parts of the economy. And apparently this idea has been there for a long time, starting in those debates. So do you, I mean, have you come across, or like, what's your take on this? How much of this idea is due to its kind of like use as an economic factor? It's sort of like benefits as an economic factor in terms of growth and sort of development, and how much of it is political in the sense that the party doesn't really want to give up its control over the economy? So like how much, do you have any sense? You may not, maybe, but like, do you have any sense in that regard? And the last question I'm going to throw up there, and maybe this is in the book and I haven't read it yet, but in addition to the price theory, this might be more recent, but there's also a debate about opening up the economy to foreign finance and stuff like that, right? This is more recent, but does that happen at that period as well? Because this is the 1980s, and this is what's happening all over the world at the same time, and all the international institutions are pushing this. And what's, that's sort of like, I'll just stop there, and you may answer like whichever you want. So I don't want to throw up too many things at you at once.
Well, these are all really great questions. I'm tempted to try to address them really quickly. Not address them quickly to get through them, not to rush. Okay. So on the classical P question, yes, this is a great question, of course. So there is a law of value debate in the Chinese context already in the 50s and 60s, some of which actually, in fact, predates the kind of Lieberman debate in Russia. And you have, you also have Mao writing on Stalin's economics of the Soviet Union and so on. So you have like a debate around the question of law of value that is connected, that precedes and is connected to the Eastern European and Russian debate. Now, in this debate, there are all sorts of different positions, but I think there are two positions that stand out and that become then also relevant in the early years of reform. And these are the positions of Xue Muqiao, which I'm chronicling quite in detail in the book, and Sun Yifang, where Sun Yifang is considered the Chinese Lieberman, and is in fact also, like, when a Chinese delegation travels to Yugoslavia and Romania, they find that people there had read Sun Yifang's work and so on. So I mean, there are like these cross-socialist connections that might not be obvious. So Sun Yifang basically argues that that you need to have a correct price system, and once you have the correct prices, you can grant enterprises greater autonomy, and then you can use the prices as the main lever to govern the economy. So, I mean, this is obviously very simplified, and it's in much more detail in the book, but this is fairly close to the kind of Lange type of ideas of market socialism. He's not using that language, he's not using neoclassical language and all of that, but he's saying things like, oh, Engels said that we can interpret it value in terms of utility. So he's making these like interesting attempts to connect to the more neoclassical or subjective kind of value theories. On the other hand, Xue Muqiao is basically arguing that the right interpretation of the law of value is that markets fluctuate around values, and that that market prices fluctuate around values, which means that values only come about through this indirect process, that there is actually no abstract way of determining what the right prices would be. There is no, if you want to put it neoclassically, there's no equilibrium value that you can identify. So therefore, what China should do instead is to unleash some of these market dynamics, not for the market dynamics' sake, but to use the market dynamics as a way to understand where the center of gravity would be, but then not become subject to these dynamics as you would become under capitalism, but guide these dynamics through these market participating type of activities, which basically smoothen the fluctuations, right? Okay, this is a very crude summary of extremely complex debates. In terms of the socialist calculation debate, I actually have a paper, a working paper out on the reception of Ludwig von Mises' contributions to the socialist calculation debate in China's 1980s, where I'm discussing that in quite a bit of detail. The short version is that the Chinese reform economists basically end up accepting Mises' critique that in a completely planned economy with universal public ownership, you do have a problem of creating a rational economy because you don't have a rational standard for value. They take inspiration from Lange in that they agree with Lange that, pretty much along the lines as I've also alluded to in the talk, that socialism could use markets. However, they disagree with Lange's proposal in terms of the specifics and basically say, this is utopian fiction. You cannot run an economy in the ways in which Lange is saying. So instead, what China should do is not create some sort of mathematically identified trial and error mechanisms that simulate the market, but actually should use the market itself as a tool for socialism. So they kind of buy into the von Mises neoliberal kind of demand for a certain kind of economic rationality, which is why I'm arguing that there is this, on this meta level, a convergence with neoliberalism, but at the same time, in terms of the specifics of what you do with this quest for that kind of rationality are fundamentally anti-neoliberal, because this idea of the state participating in specific markets and consciously manipulating the prices of specific goods is an idea that unleashes terror on the minds of neoliberal economists, right? So in that sense, it's both buying into the neoliberal logic and going straight up against it, which is a contradiction, but which I think is part of the contradiction that we are facing and dealing with China these days. In terms of lessons for development, I mean, there are all these interpretations coming out from people like Justin Yifu Lin, new structural economics or whatever he's calling it, and so on, that kind of try to create a model that captures China's experience and then say like, okay, this is the model that is now the new development economics. There's also some attempts in that direction under the label of Beijing consensus. I'm personally extremely skeptical of this, because my sense is that the main lesson of the Chinese experience is that there is no universal model. There's no package deal that you can buy into and that will solve all your problems. So in that sense, the task is not to replace the Washington consensus with the Beijing consensus, to replace one package deal with another package deal. But the task is to take more inspiration, in fact, from this logic of economic warfare. If you take these enormous structurally unequal conditions in the world economy seriously, and you are in the subordinate position, then you have to, I mean, the only advantage that you have is the knowledge of the local situation, really, right? So you have to ask yourself, what follows from this local knowledge of local conditions? Is there something where we can poke a hole into these structures that are just completely stacked against us, right? So, and then maybe another lesson is that instead of seeing market and state as a zero-sum game kind of situation where you either have more market or more state, and then you either have state-led or market-led development, you can think about this more creatively, and the state can use the market in ways that are not where the market is not the goal, but where the market is a tool. And I think there are like certain lessons around the questions of buffer stocks, around the questions of the importance of certain upstream industries, and this whole logic to come to your next question of essential versus inessential, like where do you concentrate your energies, especially if you have a weak and small state, right? I mean, where do you put the administrative capacity that you have, right? And I don't think this can be copied from the Chinese trajectory. In fact, this whole idea of essential, I think, is extremely contingent. It's not even on the sectoral level. I mean, the major national steel mill is absolutely essential. Some small-scale, inefficient, backward local steel mill might be totally inessential to the working of the system, even though they are both steel mills, right? So in that sense, and maybe at some point in time, the small steel mill was essential because there was such an excess demand for steel that running it at a loss with these totally backward production methods was still essential for moving forward in development. But then maybe 5 years later, once the modern steel mill can produce more, it has become completely inessential. So it's, in that sense, a very dynamic concept that is not simple. I mean, you cannot even solve it with input output in a way, you know? I mean, you can use input output to, I've been spending a lot of time trying to operationalize this concept. You can use input output to identify numbers of forward linkages and to get a sense of what are the industries that are important. But then within these industries, I mean, you still have all these very time contingent dynamics going on. To give you an extreme example, I mean, in the context of the pandemic, suddenly masks became totally essential, right? Which were pretty, I mean, important, but not essential in the way in which they became in the context of the pandemic. So you can also have these extreme shocks, which then lead, I mean, and this is something that is not unique to China, which leads the state to prioritize certain things that which is a result of specific dynamics. So you cannot go in with a static type of concept and say, okay, for development, this is always essential. So please, Nigeria, since this was important in China, focus on that, right? Yes, and of course, the question of essential is super political, no question about this. And I think that in the Chinese context, we can think of it as the state trying to maintain sovereignty over the market and the private sector. And I think that this is also a way of understanding what happened in 2021 in the context of the so-called regulatory crackdowns, where if you consider something like Alibaba at a time when online shopping was completely marginal, or at a time when private tutoring was something that only a very small number of rich people were doing, these things were totally non-essential, right? But if you have moved to a point where students can no longer pass the university entrance exams without going into private tutoring schools, then this has suddenly become essential, not only to the working of your economy, but your society and your political system and all of that, right? So then you see this rebalancing of the relationship between the state's sovereignty over the educational system and the private tutoring that served a certain purpose for some time because it helped China to produce students that could compete on American graduate school markets and all of this, right? But at this point, the distributive and justice considerations have become so important for political stability and social stability questions that this consideration changes, right? In terms of opening up, I just want to very quickly reiterate what I already said. I think it's important to recognize that reforms started with the recognition that the kind of big push industrialization that was attempted risked the possibility of foreign indebtedness and was therefore stopped. This also meant that while the World Bank came in with studies that were meant to assess whether China was eligible for IDA loans, the interest that China had in getting the World Bank in was not primarily getting these loans. I mean, they were useful, but they were not the primary concern. The primary concern, as both the Chinese and the World Bank officials say, was to get the expertise of the World Bank and to understand how the World Bank would be thinking about the economic problems that China is facing. But then, since they came in as one source of economic expertise amongst many, they were, as one of the World Bank officials was saying, that the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the World Bank was a marriage made in heaven, always professional, but at arm's length. They would issue the World Bank studies with a cover that was distinctly different from the covers of their own internal studies. It would land on everybody's, I mean, on the desks of all the important officials, but they would see immediately, this is what the World Bank is saying, read it, think about it, consider it carefully. These people are important and they are smart, but they are not dictating us what we are going to do. This is one proposal that we are considering. And this is why there is this kind of fierce debate, right? Because it is very seriously being considered, and it then, of course, also takes on a life of its own as the economics discipline is recreated and is turned very mainstream and very neoclassical. You get this like internal dynamic of a generation of the same kind of expertise, but this tension kind of remains. Okay, I'm already way over time.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
There's one last question that I've been holding. If that's fine for you, I'd like to also have that question. Is that okay? Okay, so this is a question from one of our PhD students, Sinan. So Sinan, I'm going to be unmuting you so that you can hopefully ask your question.
Thank you, Professor. First of all, I would like to thank the professor for this valuable information and presentation. I want to specialize in international political economy, especially about China's political economy. I think China's success, especially compared to the Soviet Union, is that it had realized political reforms will fail if they made before economic reforms. Does the professor agree with the view that Soviet experience set such an example? Because Soviet Union had begun its political reforms before completing the economic reforms. My other question is, what does the professor think about that? The applicability of a special economic zone for other emerging countries today, because as I know, China was inspired special economic zone model from Yugoslavian economy, and in other words, what was the effect of Western advanced economies for China's success with this model, since they focused their investments in China due to the low labor cost in that period? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. On the question of special economic zones, I mean, someone asked about the new economic policy, right? I mean, even in the Soviet Union, there were forms of special economic zones in these early years. So this is something that socialist economies had done for a while, right? And I think it's important to see that a special economic zone in the context of a country where the state has a lot of power over the economy is a very different type of special economic zone compared to a country that is completely liberalized and then has some special economic zone somewhere, right? Because if you have that kind of economic sovereignty on the part of the state, then the state can also use these special economic zones to extract revenues, to learn management techniques, to understand frontier technologies and all of this. If you do not have that kind of sovereignty, then your special economic zone might just become the pool of cheap labor for the sake of local capitalists, which is not to say that local capitalists didn't become enormously rich in China. And I'm not saying it always worked. I'm not saying it's like a wonderful story of pure success, but I think it is still a different constellation compared to the constellation that might emerge in many other developing contexts. In terms of political versus economic reforms, yeah, I mean, this is a huge question. It's a question that I do not get into in the book a lot because I really want to understand this pretty technical question of price reform as a way to understand the economic problems in economic system reform. But of course, there is this constant treading around this, right? There's the 81 spiritual pollution campaign, which also then like puts economic reforms on hold in a way. Then there's of course several moments of enormous political movement and culminating in 89, which is related to what is happening around price reform in 88 and so on, right? So it's and there are very major initiatives for political reform in the 80s, where some of the same people are in fact involved. So for example, Chun Yun, who's one of the key people on the gradualist dual track side of the debate, was also part of the debates around political reform, which is basically the reason why he was exiled and died in exile and never returned to China. So yes, there's a very complicated relationship there. There's also voices on the part of package reform in China who are basically saying reform is impossible without political reform, which is the line of the shock therapists, right? They are saying very explicitly, the collapse of the communist state is the sine qua non of the success of economic reforms, right? So this logic is very much present in China too. And there are even people who go as far as to say, well, if we do a big bang and it creates turmoil and it creates chaos, then this could possibly be what we need to get the kind of political reform that we need to have meaningful economic reform, right? But this is, of course, all an extremely murky field. It's extremely difficult to get reliable sources on this because, I mean, it's so political. It's very easy to slide into conspiracy theories. So this is why I think it's extremely complicated to study this question for the Chinese case anyways. Okay, sorry, there was one more question which I forgot. What was your last question? Or maybe that was it.
About special economic zone and political reform. Can we summarize your answer as economics is infrastructure and politics is superstructure?
Okay, that's a great question, which actually allows me to add one sentence that I forgot to say previously, which is, I mean, people say there was no political reform in China, right? And then some of the people that I interviewed were saying things like, this is a crazy statement. If you look at, for example, the political economy of agriculture, and you think about the transformation from a people's commune to the household responsibility system, this is a political revolution. This is the breaking up of the backbone of the political institution of the Maoist economy, of the mass movement-based kind of attempt of organizing the country, where the country was to the very, very vast majority agricultural. So in that sense, this is an enormous political reform. Similarly, I mean, on a more central level, if you think about the ways in which Mao has governed the country, and the Cultural Revolution and the Red Guards and the idea of the Mars line and all of that, and then you think of the very technocratic, very rules-based, bureaucratic, hierarchy-based governance that was created under Deng Xiaoping. This is not the kind of political reform that we have in mind if we think in simple categories from authoritarianism to Western representative democracy. But if we go beyond such very crude type of box A, box B type of categories, then there actually has been very fundamental political reform in China. I mean, the political system today compared with the political system of late Maoism is worlds apart, right? Which is why, to me, it's always absurd when people say, is Xi Jinping the new Mao? I mean, I don't know what you have read about Maoism, but to me, the two seem to be functioning on, I mean, whether it's good or bad or whatever you think about it normatively, but it's just in terms of the actual mechanisms at play, it just seems to be drastically different.